The first time the cell door closed behind me, the sound echoed longer than it should have, not because it was loud, but because it was final. Cold metal, heavy air, and the sudden, unbearable realization that the man I married was standing on the other side of that door. Free. While I wasn't, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood there, frozen, trying to understand how love could transform into something so unrecognizable, because this wasn't a stranger who betrayed me. This was my husband, the same man who once brushed my hair back gently and promised I'd never face the world alone. The same man who once looked at me like I was his entire future. And now, he was the reason I was locked away. Have you ever defended someone, even when your heart quietly whispered that something wasn't right? And what would you do if the person who vowed to protect you became the one who destroyed your life? Because that's exactly what happened to me. My husband didn't just stop loving me. He didn't just drift away. He hated me. And when I discovered the truth about his mistress, he made sure I would never be believed again. By the time the judge's gavel came down, my fate was already sealed. 2 years. 2 years behind cold walls for a crime I didn't commit. 2 years of waking up every morning wondering how the world could turn its back on the truth so easily. But what my husband didn't know, what no one knew, was that prison wouldn't break me. It would sharpen me. Because lies can live comfortably in silence. But truth is patient. And when it finally rises, it takes everything with it. Welcome, my beautiful family, to Silent Echoes of the Heart. A place where stories don't just entertain. They heal, teach, and quietly remind us that even in darkness, meaning can still be found. Before we begin, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I read your messages, and your voices matter here. And at the end of this story, I want you to rate it from 0 to 10. Not based on how shocking it is, but on how deeply it made you feel. Now, get comfortable, breathe, and let me take you back to the beginning. To the love that once felt safe. To the marriage that looked perfect from the outside. To the moment I believed, truly believed, that I had found a good man. To our returning family, thank you for always being here. And to our new viewers, you are deeply welcome. If stories like this move your heart, if you believe that truth, no matter how buried, always finds its way back to the light, please subscribe, like, and share so you never miss the next lesson wrapped inside a powerful story. This is my story, and it begins with love. Before love became something I feared, it was something I believed in. I grew up watching my father build more than a company. He built people. He believed character mattered more than ambition, and integrity mattered more than profit. In our home, conversations about success were never loud or boastful. They were thoughtful, measured, purpose-driven. My father had always told me, the right partner won't just love you, they'll protect your peace. That belief stayed with me. Which is why, when he first mentioned my husband's name, I didn't immediately think of romance. I thought of trust. My husband had worked under my father for years, not in a flashy role, but in one that required consistency, discipline, and reliability. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room. He didn't seek attention. Instead, he listened, observed, delivered results quietly. My father respected that, and when my father respected someone, I paid attention. At first, our interactions were simple, professional, polite. He would check in on projects, ask thoughtful questions, and remember small things about me, how I preferred tea over coffee, how I liked sitting near windows, how silence didn't make me uncomfortable. Those details mattered more than grand gestures ever could. Over time, our conversations shifted. From work to life. From schedules to dreams. He spoke about the future with clarity and patience. About building something meaningful. About loyalty. About partnership, not ownership. When he smiled, it wasn't performative. It was calm, reassuring. The kind of smile that made you feel seen without being overwhelmed. And when he looked at me, I felt safe. Not swept away. Not dazzled. Safe. Our relationship unfolded gently. No rushing. No pressure. He never made me feel like I owed him affection. He never pushed boundaries. When I needed space, he gave it. When I needed reassurance, he offered it without hesitation. That balance drew me in. There were evenings we spent talking quietly, long after the city had gone to sleep. He would sit across from me, listening. Not waiting to respond, but truly listening. Sometimes he reached for my hand, thumb brushing softly against my skin, as if asking permission before crossing that line. That respect made me fall. I remember the first time he told me he loved me. There was no audience, no spectacle, just us. He said it calmly, like a promise rather than a declaration, like something he had already decided, not something he was testing. And I believed him. When he proposed, it felt natural, earned. He didn't kneel in front of a crowd or deliver rehearsed lines. He simply asked if I would build a life with him, one rooted in honesty, patience, and mutual respect. I said yes, without fear. The wedding was beautiful, but not extravagant. My father walked me down the aisle with pride in his eyes, whispering that I was making a wise choice. My husband held my hands gently, as if I were something precious, something he never wanted to drop. That moment is still vivid in my mind. His eyes were warm, his smile steady, his touch sincere. Marriage, at first, felt like an extension of everything we had already built. He was attentive, thoughtful. He remembered anniversaries, checked in during long days, and made time even when work demanded more. At night, he would pull me close, resting his forehead against mine, reminding me that I wasn't alone in the world anymore. Intimacy wasn't rushed, it was layered. A shared laugh before sleep, a quiet kiss in the morning, a hand resting at the small of my back as we moved through crowded rooms. We spoke about children someday, about legacy, not wealth, but values, about traveling, about growing old with familiarity rather than boredom. Those dreams felt reachable. I trusted him completely, and trust, once given, becomes the lens through which you see everything else. Which is why, when small inconsistencies appeared later, I ignored them. Because when love begins with safety, you don't expect danger to come from the same place. If someone had asked me then whether I was happy, I would have answered without hesitation. Yes. Happiness didn't arrive in fireworks or dramatic declarations. It arrived in rhythm, in routine, in the quiet certainty that someone would be there at the end of each day. Marriage settled into our lives like a familiar song. Mornings began softly. I would wake before him sometimes, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, tracing the calmness on his face with my eyes. There was something grounding about knowing I was not alone anymore, that my life was no longer a solo journey. He used to reach for me in his sleep, his arm finding its way around my waist as if my presence anchored him. Those moments felt intimate in the purest sense, not driven by desire, but by closeness. We shared breakfasts when schedules allowed. He preferred his meals simple. I preferred mine warm and comforting. Sometimes he would tease me for lingering too long over tea, and I would smile, thinking how ordinary happiness could be. In the evenings, we talked, not about grand achievements, but about the day, the small frustrations, the quiet wins. He asked questions, and I felt heard. He listened with the kind of attention that made you feel like your words mattered. Intimacy grew naturally. There was tenderness in the way he touched me, never hurried, always deliberate. When he kissed me, it felt like reassurance more than passion. When we lay together at night, the closeness felt safe, like we were building something that couldn't easily be shaken. I believed love had chosen me kindly, and perhaps that belief was what made me blind. The first year passed peacefully. We attended company events together, standing side by side, presenting a united front. People admired us. Some even envied what we had. They spoke of balance, how we complemented each other, how grounded we seemed. My father watched us with quiet satisfaction. He often invited us over for dinner, and those evenings felt warm and full. He would ask my husband about work, about vision, about leadership. My husband answered confidently, but respectfully, never overstepping, never challenging my father openly. Looking back, I realize how carefully he played that role. At the time, I thought it was humility. My father trusted him deeply, sometimes too deeply. He involved him in decisions that extended beyond professional boundaries. He saw him not just as an employee, but as family, a future steward of everything he had built. That trust strengthened my own. The second year brought change, but at first it felt like growth. Work demands increased. Responsibilities expanded. My husband traveled more frequently. He explained it as progress, as opportunity. I supported him fully. I never complained when dinners were postponed or weekends interrupted. I told myself this was what partnership meant. We adjusted our routines. Late-night phone calls replaced shared meals. Short texts replaced long conversations. But when he was home, he tried, at least that's what I told myself. There were still moments of closeness. Sometimes, after days apart, he would pull me close as soon as he stepped through the door, resting his forehead against mine as if grounding himself. In those moments, I felt chosen again. But something subtle shifted beneath the surface. He became more guarded. His phone was always within reach. Notifications were silenced more often. When I asked about his trips, his answers were brief, not unkind, but closed. "You wouldn't be interested," he'd say lightly. "It's just logistics." At first, I laughed it off. Why would I question the man I trusted with my life? But unease doesn't announce itself loudly. It arrives in fragments. Like the night I woke to find him sitting at the edge of the bed, fully dressed, staring at his phone. When I asked if everything was okay, he smiled and said work was heavy lately. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Another time, I noticed he had started stepping outside to take certain calls. When I asked who it was, he replied calmly, "Family matters." Family. That word carried weight. I never questioned it. Our physical intimacy, though still present, began to feel different. Less spontaneous, more scheduled. When I reached for him, sometimes he hesitated, just slightly, before responding. I told myself I was imagining things, but the twist came quietly. One evening, during a company function, I stood alone near the balcony, while he spoke with a woman I didn't recognize. She laughed softly at something he said, her hand brushing his arm casually, too casually. When I approached, he introduced her quickly. "She's family," he said, "a distant cousin. Helps with operations." Her smile lingered on him a moment longer than necessary before she turned to me. She was composed, confident, and strangely familiar, like someone who already knew where she belonged. Her name was Mistress. She greeted me politely, but there was something unreadable in her eyes. Not hostility, not warmth either. Possession. The interaction was brief, and yet it stayed with me long after the evening ended. When I asked about her later, my husband brushed it off. "She's been around for years," he said. "Nothing you need to worry about." The words "you need to worry about" echoed uncomfortably. Still, I chose trust. That was my mistake. Because love, once established, doesn't question easily. The distance grew gradually. He missed anniversaries. He forgot small promises. When I mentioned feeling lonely, he dismissed it gently but firmly. "You're overthinking," he said. "Everything's fine." But everything wasn't fine. At night, I began lying awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet between us grow heavier. His body was beside mine, but his presence felt far away, like he was already living a separate life I hadn't been invited into. And yet, I clung to the memory of who he had been. The man who once made me feel safe. The man my father trusted. The man I married believing he would protect me. I didn't realize then that peace can sometimes be the calm before unraveling. Because while I was holding on to the image of love we had built, something else was already taking shape in the shadows. Something patient. Something calculated. And by the time I sensed the shift fully, it was already too late. There are moments in life that divide time into before and after. You don't recognize them at first. They arrive quietly, disguised as ordinary days. The morning my father died began like any other. I remember standing in the kitchen, watching the steam rise from my cup of tea. The sun filtered through the windows in soft, forgiving light. Everything felt suspended in calm. I didn't know that calm was about to disappear forever. The call came just after 8. I stared at the screen before answering, confused by the unfamiliar number. Something in my chest tightened, not fear yet, just unease. The voice on the other end was formal, measured, too composed for the words it carried. There had been an accident, a collision on a quiet stretch of road. Emergency responders arrived quickly. They did everything they could, but my father didn't make it. I don't remember dropping the phone, but I remember the sound it made when it hit the floor. I remember the room spinning. I remember trying to breathe and failing. Grief didn't arrive as tears. It arrived as silence. My body moved without instruction. I sat. I stood. I paced. My hands shook, but my mind felt disconnected, as if the news belonged to someone else. When my husband came into the room, I looked at him, expecting the world to make sense again. It didn't. He wrapped his arms around me, and I let myself collapse into him. His embrace felt firm, steady. He whispered reassurances I barely heard, words about strength, about time, about not being alone. For the first time since the call, I cried. The days that followed blurred together. The funeral was filled with people, colleagues, friends, business partners. They spoke of my father's vision, his leadership, his legacy. I listened politely, nodding when expected, smiling when required. Inside, I was empty. My husband stayed close during those days. He held my hand through the service. He guided me through conversations when my voice failed. He told me I was strong. I believed him. But something changed after we buried my father. At first, it was so subtle I questioned whether I was imagining it. He became quieter. Not withdrawn, just distant. When I cried at night, he comforted me briefly, then suggested rest. When I spoke about my father, he listened, but his eyes seemed elsewhere, as if he were calculating something beyond the moment. I told myself grief affects people differently. I didn't realize grief can also reveal truths. A week after the funeral, he returned to work with unusual urgency. Meetings stretched longer. Trips became more frequent. He spoke in absolutes now. Needs to be done, no choice, time-sensitive. I stayed home, surrounded by memories and silence. Grief deepened in isolation. My father had been my anchor. Without him, the world felt unstable. And the person I leaned on most, my husband, was slowly pulling away. The shift in him became more pronounced. He stopped asking how I was feeling. He stopped noticing my exhaustion. When I mentioned struggling to sleep, he suggested I focus on moving forward, as if grief had an expiration date. I began handling estate matters alone. Paperwork, meetings, decisions that should have been shared. When I asked for his help, he said he was overwhelmed at work that now involved my father's company more deeply than ever. That should have comforted me. Instead, it unsettled me. One evening, I asked him directly if everything was okay between us. He sighed, rubbing his temples as if I were adding to his burden. "You've changed," he said. "You're always sad, always heavy." The words stung. I wanted to ask him how I was supposed to feel after losing my father. But the way he looked at me, irritated, tired, made me swallow the question. I started apologizing for my grief, for my sadness, for my silence, for my tears. That's how love begins to unravel, not with shouting, but with blame disguised as concern. Weeks passed, and his resentment grew. He no longer touched me at night. When he did, it felt distant, mechanical, like an obligation. He slept facing away from me, phone glowing softly in the dark more often than not. When I asked about his travels, he snapped. "You don't trust me? Why are you always questioning everything? Can't you just let things be?" The man who once reassured me now accused me. I began doubting myself. Was I becoming difficult? Was grief making me unreasonable? Gaslighting doesn't always come as cruelty. Sometimes it arrives as dismissal, and slowly I started shrinking. The real break came one afternoon when I overheard him on the phone. He was in the study, door partially open. His voice was low, urgent. Not the professional tone he used at work, but something softer, more familiar. "No, not now," he said. "She's still sensitive." I froze. She? I asked later, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked at me sharply, then softened his expression. Family? He said quickly. Logistics. That word again. Family? I wanted to believe him. But doubt had taken root. That night, I lay awake, listening to him breathe beside me, wondering how two people could occupy the same space and feel worlds apart. And then came the realization I tried hardest to ignore. He no longer looked at me with love. He looked at me like a problem, like an obstacle, like something standing between him and a life he wanted without me in it. That was the day everything shifted. Not because he said something cruel, but because I understood something fundamental had changed. The safety I once felt was gone, and in its place was something cold, something calculating, something that would eventually cost me everything. Love doesn't vanish all at once. It fades. It thins out slowly, like warmth leaving a room you didn't realize was growing colder until you start shivering. After my father's death, the distance between my husband and me became undeniable. It was no longer subtle. It no longer hid behind excuses. It settled into our home like an uninvited guest, silent, persistent, impossible to ignore. He stopped coming home at the same time. At first, it was an hour later than usual. Then 2, then sometimes not until after midnight. When I asked where he'd been, his answers were clipped. Meetings, travel delays. You know how work is. I tried to adapt. I told myself this was temporary. That pressure changes people. That love required patience. So I waited. I kept the house warm. Dinner prepared. Lights on. Some nights I fell asleep on the couch, still dressed, waiting for the sound of the door opening. When he finally arrived, he rarely noticed. He moved quietly, as if trying not to wake someone, but not because he cared, because he didn't want questions. And I learned to stop asking. The conversations we once shared disappeared. Where there had been laughter, there was now silence. Where there had been intimacy, there was distance. When I reached for him in bed, he shifted away slightly, as though my touch interrupted something more important. I remember one night in particular. I had just come out of the shower, hair still damp, wrapped in a soft robe he once loved. I sat beside him on the bed, close enough to feel his warmth. He didn't look up from his phone. I rested my hand on his arm, gentle, tentative. He stiffened. "Not tonight," he said without meeting my eyes. The words weren't cruel. They were worse. They were indifferent. I pulled my hand back slowly, feeling foolish, exposed, unwanted. That night, I lay awake beside him, staring into the dark, wondering how someone could sleep so peacefully while the person next to them felt invisible. Days blurred together. He became sharper in his tone, quicker to dismiss me. When I spoke about feeling lonely, he accused me of being needy. When I mentioned concerns about his schedule, he said I was controlling. "You're always watching me," he said once. Always waiting for something to be wrong. I wanted to ask him why there was something wrong. But the way he framed it made me question myself. Was I imagining things? Gaslighting doesn't feel like manipulation at first. It feels like confusion. I began replaying conversations in my head, analyzing my words, my tone, my expressions. I wondered if grief had made me overly sensitive, if sadness had distorted my perception. I apologized often for my mood, for my questions, for my presence. That was when love stopped feeling like partnership and started feeling like performance. He no longer shared plans with me. Travel dates appeared suddenly. Bags packed without discussion. When I asked where he was going, he responded vaguely. "Out of town. You wouldn't understand the details." Those words chipped away at me. I had once been his equal, his confidant. Now, I was someone he excluded. At company events, his behavior shifted dramatically. In public, he was composed, polite, even charming. He placed a hand on my back when people were watching. He smiled when cameras were near. Anyone looking at us would have seen a devoted husband. But the moment we were alone, the warmth vanished. It felt intentional, as though he was maintaining an image for the world while erasing me behind closed doors. That was when I noticed her again. Sarah-less. She appeared more frequently now. Always professional. Always nearby. She attended meetings that didn't seem to require her presence. She traveled when he traveled. When he spoke to her, his voice softened, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. Once, I watched them from across a room. They stood close, not touching, but close enough to share quiet laughter. Close enough that their shoulders brushed. Something in my chest tightened painfully. When I confronted him that evening, his reaction shocked me. He didn't deny it. He scoffed. "You're being ridiculous," he said. "She's family." Family. That word had become a shield. When I pointed out how often they were together, how his tone changed around her, his face hardened. "Are you accusing me of something?" he snapped. "After everything I do for this family?" The conversation ended with me apologizing, again. That night, I cried quietly into my pillow, careful not to make a sound. I didn't recognize myself anymore. The woman who once felt secure now walked on eggshells in her own home. The woman who once spoke freely now measured every sentence. I started keeping my thoughts to myself. Not because I wanted to, but because expressing them felt dangerous. The emotional neglect deepened. He no longer asked about my day. He stopped noticing my absence when I left the room. When I dressed nicely, he didn't comment. When I was unwell, he barely acknowledged it. One evening, I mentioned feeling overwhelmed by managing my father's estate alone. His response was cold. "You need to toughen up," he said. "Life doesn't stop." That was the moment I realized something terrifying. He wasn't just distant. He resented me, resented my grief, resented my presence, resented what I represented. I wondered if my father's death had changed more than our lives. I wondered if it had removed something that was protecting me. The house no longer felt like home. It felt like a waiting room, somewhere I passed time unsure of what I was waiting for. And still, I clung to hope. Hope that this was temporary. Hope that love would return. Hope that the man I married was still somewhere beneath the coldness. That hope nearly destroyed me, because when love turns cold, it doesn't warn you before it becomes cruel. And I didn't yet realize that what I was experiencing wasn't just emotional distance. It was preparation for something far worse. There is a particular kind of pain that comes not from certainty, but from suspicion. Because suspicion forces you to live between truth and denial, constantly negotiating with your own instincts. That was where I existed when Sorella stopped being a name and became a presence. At first, she had been an occasional figure, someone I could dismiss with effort. But now, she was everywhere. At meetings, at events, in conversations that fell silent when I entered a room, and always, my husband insisted there was nothing unusual. "She's family," he repeated. "A distant cousin." The phrase lost meaning the more he used it. The first time I saw her in our home, something inside me shifted. I came back earlier than expected one afternoon, my mind heavy with paperwork and unresolved grief. As I unlocked the door, I heard laughter. Soft, familiar, intimate. Not mine. I paused, hand still on the handle. The laughter came from the living room. When I stepped inside, they both looked up. My husband stood quickly, as if caught off guard. Sarah-less remained seated, composed, her posture relaxed, as though she belonged there. "Oh," he said. "You're back early." I nodded slowly, forcing a smile. Sarah-less stood and greeted me warmly, but her eyes searched my face, measuring, assessing. She spoke with confidence, her voice calm and assured. "We were just discussing logistics," she said. Logistics. That word had become a convenient explanation for everything that felt wrong. I offered her a polite response, then excused myself, retreating into the bedroom. My heart pounded harder with every step. That night, I lay awake replaying the scene. The familiarity between them, the ease, the way he hadn't introduced her, just assumed I already knew. The next weeks confirmed what my heart already feared. Sarah-less began appearing regularly. She attended dinners that felt too private. She joined trips that made no sense for her role. When I questioned her involvement, my husband's responses grew sharper. "Why are you obsessed with her?" You're imagining things. This paranoia is exhausting. Paranoia. That word lodged itself deep inside me. I started observing quietly, not accusing, not confronting, watching. I noticed how he smiled around her, how his shoulders relaxed, how he laughed freely in her presence, but rarely with me. I noticed how she spoke to him without hesitation, without deference. Once, during a company gathering, I watched her adjust his tie, casually, comfortably, intimately. When I later mentioned it, he exploded. "She's helping," he snapped. "You're reading too much into everything." His anger frightened me. Not because it was loud, but because it was defensive. I began feeling like a guest in my own marriage. Intimacy between us vanished completely. He no longer reached for me, no longer kissed me goodbye. Nights passed in silence, our bodies separated by inches that felt like miles. And yet, in public, he maintained the illusion. He smiled. He held my hand. He spoke of unity. The contradiction made me feel unsteady. I started doubting my own senses. Until one night, doubt became clarity. I overheard them again. This time, I wasn't trying to. I had gone to bed early, exhausted from emotional strain. Sometime later, I woke to the sound of voices downstairs. His voice. Her voice. Low. Familiar. Too close. I stood at the top of the stairs, heart racing. "I can't keep doing this," he said quietly. "She's starting to notice," Saralys responded calmly. "You should have handled it sooner." There was a pause. "I will," he said. "Just give me time." I retreated silently, shaking. The words echoed in my mind. Handled it. I didn't sleep that night. The following days were a blur. I moved through routines mechanically, my thoughts consumed by what I had heard. When I finally confronted him, my voice was steady, but my heart wasn't. "I know there's something going on," I said. "Please, just be honest with me." He stared at me for a long moment. Then he laughed. Not kindly, not awkwardly, but dismissively. "You're losing control," he said. "You need help." The words felt like a slap. In that moment, I realized something devastating. He wasn't just denying the truth. He was rewriting reality, and worse, he wanted me to believe his version. I felt isolated in a way I had never experienced before. The person who once protected me now undermined my perception of truth. The woman he claimed was family now occupied space that used to be mine. And still, I hesitated. Because accepting the truth meant accepting betrayal. And betrayal carries consequences. I told myself to wait, to observe, to gather clarity. But clarity came faster than I expected. One evening, I followed him. Not out of rage, but desperation. I watched him enter a residence I didn't recognize. I waited outside, heart pounding, debating whether to leave. When I knocked, the door opened slowly. Saralys stood there. Her expression shifted from surprise to something else, something unreadable. Behind her, I saw my husband. In that moment, denial collapsed. I didn't scream. I didn't accuse. I simply asked one question. How long? Neither of them answered. And before anything else could be said, everything spiraled into chaos. But that was only the beginning. Curiosity doesn't always feel reckless. Sometimes it feels necessary. By the time I followed my husband that night, curiosity had already transformed into survival. I wasn't chasing drama. I wasn't trying to catch him in wrongdoing. I was trying to reclaim my sanity. The evening began quietly. He told me he had a late meeting, his voice flat, eyes avoiding mine. He didn't ask how my day had been. He didn't kiss my forehead like he once used to. He just grabbed his keys and left. I waited. Not immediately. I sat alone for nearly an hour, staring at the wall, replaying every conversation, every half-truth, every unexplained absence. My chest felt tight, as if my heart already knew something my mind was still resisting. Finally, I picked up my coat. I told myself I would turn back if I felt foolish, if the streets felt empty, if doubt outweighed resolve. It didn't. I followed him at a distance, careful not to draw attention. The city lights blurred past as my thoughts raced ahead of my courage. He drove confidently, without hesitation, as though this route was familiar. That hurt more than I expected. When he finally stopped, it wasn't at an office building or a hotel. It was a quiet residential street. The kind of place where people settle into routines, where neighbors recognize each other, where secrets feel out of place, until you realize they aren't. He parked and stepped out, checking his surroundings briefly before walking toward a modest home at the end of the block. I stayed in my car, heart pounding, watching as he knocked. The door opened almost immediately. Mistress. She didn't look surprised to see him. That was the moment denial died. I sat there for several seconds, unable to move. My hands trembled against the steering wheel. I felt exposed, as though the truth had stripped me bare before I was ready to face it. I could have left. I should have left. But something inside me refused. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the house, each step heavier than the last. The night air felt sharp against my skin, biting, unforgiving. When I reached the door, my hand hovered before knocking. I remember thinking, this is the last moment I can still pretend. Then I knocked. The door opened slowly. Mistress stood there, her expression flickering through surprise, annoyance, and then something colder. Behind her, I saw my husband. For a brief second, our eyes met. He didn't look guilty. He looked irritated. "What are you doing here?" he asked. The question stunned me. Not, "How did you find us?" Not, "We need to talk." But, "What are you doing here?" As if I was the intruder. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay steady. "I deserve an explanation." Mistress stepped aside reluctantly, allowing me in. The room smelled faintly of something sweet and unfamiliar. The space was tidy, lived in, comfortable, evidence of a life that existed outside of me. My husband closed the door behind us. Silence filled the room. I looked between them, waiting. "How long?" I asked quietly. Neither answered. Mistress crossed her arms, studying me like an inconvenience. My husband sighed. "This isn't the time," he said. "You're overreacting." Overreacting. That word again. I felt something inside me crack. Not shatter, but split. "You lied to me," I said. "You made me feel like I was losing my mind." He shook his head dismissively. "You imagined most of it." I laughed then, not out of humor, but disbelief. "You're standing here with her," I said. "In her home?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You shouldn't have followed me." The implications stung. Not regret, not apology. Blame. Mistress shifted uncomfortably. "This is getting out of hand," she muttered. Something in her tone ignited my anger. "You knew," I said, turning to her. "You knew he was married." She met my gaze evenly. "You weren't supposed to find out like this." That was her only response. No remorse. No apology. Just inconvenience. The argument escalated quickly. Voices rose. Accusations spilled out. Years of tension collided in seconds. I demanded honesty. He deflected. She interjected, dismissive and impatient. Then, suddenly, Mistress staggered. At first, I thought she had tripped. She reached for the counter, her face draining of color. "What's happening?" I asked instinctively, stepping forward. She collapsed. Everything froze. For a moment, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. My husband rushed to her side, calling her name. I stood there, stunned, heart racing, trying to process what I was seeing. "Call for help," I said. "She needs help." He looked up at me, eyes sharp, calculating. "Don't touch anything," he said. That was strange. Mistress's breathing was shallow. Her skin felt cold when I checked for a pulse. Panic surged through me. I reached for my phone. Before I could dial, my husband grabbed my wrist. "Stop," he said firmly. "What are you doing?" I cried. "She's not okay." He released me abruptly and stepped back. Sirens filled the distance moments later, too quickly. The door burst open. Lights, voices, movement. Everything blurred. Hands pulled me away. Questions were shouted. I tried to explain, but my words tangled together. My husband stood nearby, his arm around Sorellis now, speaking calmly to the authorities. "She came here angry," he said. "She accused us of everything. She lost control." I stared at him in disbelief. "No," I said. "That's not true." But the room wasn't listening anymore. Someone asked if I had touched anything. Someone else asked why I was there. My husband didn't look at me. Sorellis was taken away, and I was escorted out, hands restrained, heart breaking. As they led me away, I looked back one last time. My husband finally met my eyes. There was no regret there, only resolve. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't just betrayal, it was a setup, and I had walked straight into it. Silence has weight. I learned that the moment the door of the interrogation room closed behind me. It wasn't a loud slam. It didn't need to be. The sound was soft, controlled, like everything else that night. Like the way my husband had spoken, like the way the story about me was already being written without my voice. I sat alone at a metal table, hands resting in my lap, heart pounding so loudly I was certain someone outside could hear it. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and cold air. Time stretched unnaturally, seconds dragging into something heavier. A man entered eventually, then another. They asked questions calmly, methodically, as if rehearsed. "Why were you there? Did you know the woman? Had there been an argument? Did you touch anything in the house?" I answered truthfully, my voice trembling but steady. I explained how I followed my husband, how I wanted answers, how I panicked when she collapsed. They listened, but listening doesn't always mean believing. Each time I mentioned my husband, their expressions shifted slightly. Not dramatically, just enough to suggest doubt. Not toward him, toward me. When they finally left the room, the silence returned, heavier than before. That was when fear crept in. Not sudden panic, but slow realization. I was alone. Hours later, I was formally charged. The words felt unreal as they were read aloud. Accusations wrapped in formal language. Claims that didn't match the truth I knew. I asked to see my husband. They told me he had already given his statement. I asked what he said. They didn't answer. The holding cell was small, dimly lit, and unforgiving. I sat on the bench, staring at the wall, replaying the night over and over, searching for the moment where I could have done something differently. I didn't yet understand that the outcome had already been decided. When I finally saw him again, it wasn't in private. It was across a room filled with strangers. He sat composed, dressed neatly, posture relaxed. He didn't look like a man in crisis. He looked like a man in control. When our eyes met, something in me reached out instinctively. Hope, maybe. Or disbelief. He didn't respond. He spoke calmly when questioned. His voice steady. His words precise. He described me as emotional, unstable, hurt by betrayal, capable of acting irrationally. Each sentence cut deeper than the last. He spoke of concern for my well-being, of fear, of regret that things had escalated. He never once defended me. I wanted to scream. Instead, I sat frozen, watching the man I loved construct a version of me I barely recognized. Sorellis's condition was discussed in hushed tones. The room filled with speculation. The narrative hardened quickly. I tried to speak. Every time I did, I felt smaller. Because the truth, when spoken without power, sounds like desperation. The trial came faster than I expected. My days blurred together as legal proceedings advanced. I was assigned representation, but it felt distant, procedural. My lawyer did his job, but without witnesses willing to challenge the story, his efforts felt like whispers against a storm. My husband became the cornerstone of the case. A grieving, concerned spouse. A reliable professional. A calm voice in contrast to my visible distress. The irony nearly broke me. The man who once held me through grief now used it to dismantle me. During one hearing, I looked at him, searching his face for something, anything, that resembled the man I married. I found nothing. He avoided my gaze completely. That hurt more than any accusation. When the judge finally delivered the verdict, the room felt impossibly quiet. Words were spoken. Sentences formed. Consequences assigned. 2 years. 2 years of my life reduced to a number. The gavel fell. And just like that, everything I had known ended. I don't remember being led away. I don't remember the faces in the room. I remember the feeling in my chest, hollow, heavy, unreal. The ride to the facility passed in silence. The world outside the window looked unchanged. People walking, cars moving, life continuing. Mine had stopped. Processing took hours. Belongings were taken. Jewelry removed. Clothing exchanged for something shapeless and unfamiliar. Each step stripped away another layer of who I used to be. I was assigned a number, a cell, a routine. The first night was the hardest. The lights dimmed, but never fully went out. Sounds echoed through the corridor. Voices, footsteps, distant doors closing. I lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. That was when the truth settled fully. The man I loved had chosen himself. Not once. Not by accident. Deliberately. He didn't hesitate. He didn't waver. He had watched me be taken away and said nothing. Love didn't just die that night. It was erased. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. Prison has a way of forcing reflection upon you. With nothing to distract you, your mind becomes both enemy and companion. I replayed memories endlessly. The early kindness, the quiet moments, the first signs I ignored. I asked myself 1,000 times how I could have been so wrong. Loneliness was constant. Letters were rare. Visits, non-existent. No one from my husband's side reached out. No explanations. No apologies. Just absence. And absence, I learned, can be louder than any accusation. I stopped crying eventually. Not because the pain disappeared, but because tears required energy I no longer had. Instead, I observed. I listened. I learned how easily truth can be bent when someone controls the narrative, and how silence can be used as a weapon. But even in that silence, something inside me refused to disappear. I reminded myself daily, I know what happened. I know who I am. And I know this story isn't over, because lies need constant protection. Truth only needs time. Prison does not announce itself as punishment. It introduces itself as routine. The first thing I learned was that time behaves differently behind locked doors. Days don't move forward, they repeat. Mornings arrive without promise. Nights come without relief. And somewhere in between, you learn how to exist in a space that was never meant to hold your future. My cell was small, colder than I expected. The walls were marked with faint scratches, remnants of people who had tried to leave proof that they existed. The bed creaked when I moved. The air smelled of metal and cleaning solution. That space became my world. At first, I counted everything. Steps from the door to the bed. Minutes until lights out. Days since the trial. Counting gave me the illusion of control. But eventually, numbers lost meaning. What remained was survival. The early days were the hardest. Not because of fear, but because of disbelief. I woke each morning expecting clarity, as if someone would step in and say there had been a mistake. No one ever did. Meals came at the same time every day. Voices echoed down the hallways. Conversations overlapped. Somewhere nearby, someone always seemed to be laughing or crying or shouting. Life continued, just not mine. I kept to myself at first. I didn't trust anyone. I didn't want to hear stories that mirrored my own pain. I didn't want to be reminded that this place was full of lives interrupted. At night, I replayed my marriage in fragments. The way my husband once held my hand. The sound of his voice when he said my name. The warmth I believed was love. Those memories hurt more than the cold bed ever could. Because love, when lost, leaves a sharper wound than hatred. Weeks passed. Then, months. Eventually, isolation became unbearable. I started speaking to other women, tentatively at first. Short conversations, shared glances, mutual understanding without explanation. Everyone there carried a story. Some were loud about it. Some guarded. Some broken. Some hardened. I learned quickly that pain has many faces. There was a woman who spoke endlessly about the children she missed. Another who never spoke at all. One who laughed too easily, as if laughter was armor. I listened more than I talked. Listening taught me something important. Most people weren't defined by their worst moments. They were defined by what happened after. I began to realize that prison wasn't just a place of confinement. It was a mirror. With nothing to distract you, you're forced to confront yourself. Every regret, every mistake, every truth you avoided. I had time to think, too much time. I examined every decision I had made, every excuse I had accepted, every boundary I had allowed to be crossed. I stopped asking why he did what he did. Instead, I asked myself a harder question. Why did I ignore the signs? That realization was painful, but necessary, because understanding that didn't make me weak. It made me wiser. Slowly, I changed. Not physically, but internally. I started waking up earlier, using the quiet moments before the noise began. I exercised in the limited space I had. I read everything I could get my hands on. I wrote, pages and pages, though no one would ever read them. Writing became my anchor. It reminded me that my voice still existed, even if no one was listening. Some days were harder than others. Anniversaries came and went unnoticed. Birthdays passed quietly. Holidays felt hollow. But with each passing month, something unexpected happened. The anger softened. Not because I forgave, but because anger requires energy. And energy, I learned, was precious. I redirected it. I focused on resilience. I reminded myself daily, this is not the end of my story. There were moments of weakness. Nights when grief hit without warning, when loneliness wrapped around me tightly, making it hard to breathe, when memories surfaced uninvited. But even then, I didn't break. I bent. And bending, I discovered, is not the same as breaking. I learned to stand taller, even in a place designed to make you feel small. I learned patience. I learned restraint. And most importantly, I learned clarity. By the second year, I no longer recognized the woman who had entered those walls. She had been fragile, searching for validation, desperate to be believed. I was no longer her. I was quieter now, observant, grounded. I watched patterns. I listened to conversations. I noticed how people behaved when they thought no one was watching. That awareness sharpened something inside me. I stopped seeing myself as a victim of circumstance. I started seeing myself as a survivor of deception. And survival changes you. Toward the end of my sentence, a strange calm settled over me. Not hope, but readiness. I knew, deep down, that this wasn't where my story ended. I didn't know how the truth would come to light. I didn't know when, but I knew one thing with certainty. The man who framed me believed the chapter was closed. He was wrong. Because time had given me something he underestimated: perspective. And when the door finally opened, when my name was called and I was told to gather my things, I felt something unfamiliar stir inside me. Not relief, resolve. I stepped out of that place carrying fewer possessions, but more strength than I had ever known. 2 years had taken much from me, but they had given me something invaluable in return: myself. Hope is dangerous when you've learned to live without it. By the time it returned to me, I barely recognized it. The message arrived quietly, without ceremony. No announcement, no promise of freedom, just a name spoken during a routine meeting, delivered in the same tone used for instructions and schedules. Someone has requested to review your case. I didn't react at first. After 2 years, hope felt impractical, like a language I no longer spoke. I had learned to survive without expecting mercy, without trusting good news. Still, something in my chest tightened. The name came next: an attorney who had once worked closely with my father. I hadn't heard that name in years. Memory rushed back suddenly, late evenings when my father discussed work, over dinner, conversations about ethics, about safeguarding the future. This man had been one of the few my father trusted completely. That detail mattered. I didn't celebrate. I didn't cry. I waited. When the attorney finally sat across from me, he didn't rush into legal language. He didn't promise miracles. He didn't speak down to me or at me. He looked at me, really looked. And then he said something no one else had said since the night I was arrested. "I believe you." The words hit harder than any verdict. I lowered my gaze, unsure how to respond. Belief felt fragile, like something that might dissolve if acknowledged too loudly. He explained carefully. There had been inconsistencies. Timelines that didn't align. Statements that felt rehearsed. Decisions that had been made too quickly. He wasn't accusing anyone yet. He was listening, and that alone changed everything. Over the following weeks, he returned often. Each visit peeled back another layer of silence. He asked questions I hadn't been asked before, not about my emotions, but about details. Where I had been standing. Who spoke first. What felt wrong, even if I couldn't explain why. For the first time, I felt heard, not as a defendant, but as a human being. The appeal process moved slowly, painfully slowly. There were no guarantees, no dramatic breakthroughs, just paperwork, requests, and patience. I learned not to measure progress by days, but by direction. And direction, finally, was shifting. When the decision came, it wasn't exoneration. It was probation, conditional release, freedom with restraints, but freedom nonetheless. I walked out quietly. No cameras, no headlines, no apologies. The world didn't pause to acknowledge my return, and that was fine. Because this time, I wasn't seeking validation. I was seeking truth. I didn't go home. Not immediately. I knew better. The life I had left behind no longer belonged to me, and the man who framed me believed I was still behind walls, still powerless. I intended to keep it that way. Through careful planning and the attorney's discretion, I stayed out of sight. No announcements, no social presence, no shared locations. I became invisible by design. And in that invisibility, I gained clarity. I reflected on everything prison had taught me. Patience, restraint, observation. I understood now that confronting lies head-on rarely dismantles them. You let them expose themselves. That was when I made my decision. I wouldn't confront my husband. I wouldn't demand answers. I would investigate him. Quietly, methodically, without warning. Through discreet channels, the attorney connected me to a private investigator. Someone professional, detached, experienced in following patterns without disrupting them. I never met him face to face. That was intentional. The less connected I was, the safer the truth remained. The investigator began with observation, travel records, financial movements, unusual patterns, meetings that didn't align with official schedules, relationships that went deeper than surface explanations. Weeks passed, then months, and slowly, pieces began to surface. Not conclusions, clues. I learned to wait. Waiting had once been agony. Now, it was strategy. During this time, I didn't allow myself to dwell on revenge. Anger clouded judgment. I needed clarity, not satisfaction. I rebuilt myself quietly. I read. I exercised. I wrote again, this time with intention. I strengthened my body and my mind, preparing for whatever truth awaited me. And then one evening, the call came. The investigator didn't speak urgently. He didn't dramatize. He spoke carefully, choosing his words with precision. There are inconsistencies, he said. Significant ones. He explained how movements overlapped, how timelines contradicted statements, how certain actions didn't align with grief or shock, but with preparation. I listened in silence, my heart pounding, not with fear, but with recognition. This was it. The fog was lifting, but I stopped him before he continued. Don't tell me everything yet, I said. Not until you're sure, because I had learned something crucial. Truth, when revealed too quickly, can overwhelm. I needed it solid, unavoidable. In the days that followed, I lived in quiet anticipation. I didn't celebrate my release. I didn't seek comfort. I waited. Because somewhere out there, the man who had taken everything from me was living freely, confident in his version of events. He believed the past was buried. He believed I was gone. and that belief would become his greatest mistake. Because while he moved through life unchecked, I was finally awake. Freedom felt different the second time. There were no cheers, no relief-filled tears, no sense of victory, only awareness. When I stepped outside after my release on appeal and probation, the air felt unfamiliar, as though the world had continued evolving while I stood still. Cars passed. People laughed. Life moved forward without acknowledging what I had endured. And I let it. Because this freedom wasn't meant to be visible. Not yet. I stayed hidden by choice. No announcements, no reunions, no return to places that still carried my name. The man who framed me believed I was still behind walls, still powerless, still silenced. That belief protected me. I lived quietly, carefully, as though every movement mattered, because it did. I understood now that truth doesn't need noise. It needs patience. The attorney advised caution. He warned me that confrontation would only alert those who had something to hide. If I wanted clarity, real clarity, I would need to let the past reveal itself without interference. So I did the hardest thing imaginable. I stayed silent. While the world believed my story was over, I began rewriting it privately. The investigator moved like a shadow. He followed routines, not emotions. He didn't assume guilt. He observed behavior. He tracked patterns the way one follows footprints after a storm, carefully, knowing the smallest detail could matter. I received updates sparingly, never all at once, just enough to confirm movement. My husband had settled into his life comfortably, too comfortably. He traveled with ease, conducted business confidently, lived like a man unburdened by consequences. That confidence told its own story. The investigator documented everything: dates, times, locations, financial flows, nothing sensational, just facts. Weeks passed, then months. At times, the waiting tested me. Old emotions threatened to resurface: anger, grief, betrayal. But prison had taught me discipline. I didn't let emotion guide me anymore. Emotion clouds judgment. Clarity exposes truth. Slowly, patterns emerged. Trips that overlapped with critical moments in the past. Payments that didn't align with stated purposes. Meetings held in places deliberately distant from professional circles. And then, something subtle but unmistakable. A timeline discrepancy. One detail out of place, then another. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they formed a picture that refused to be ignored. The investigator didn't dramatize it when he called. "I think we need to review something," he said. I listened as he explained calmly, laying out the facts as if arranging pieces on a table. Certain movements didn't align with shock or grief. Certain decisions were made too quickly. Certain actions suggested planning, not reaction. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with recognition. This wasn't coincidence. I asked him to continue, to go deeper. And that was when the past began speaking clearly. Details from before my arrest surfaced, moments I hadn't understood at the time. Decisions my husband made immediately after my father's death. Changes in authority. Transfers that occurred quietly, efficiently. It wasn't just what he did. It was when he did it. Timing, I learned, tells the truth people try hardest to hide. The investigator followed leads patiently. He reconstructed movements with precision. He compared statements to actions. And slowly, the picture sharpened. I remember the night everything clicked. Not with a dramatic reveal, but with stillness. I sat alone, reviewing notes, timelines spread across the table, and suddenly, there it was, the connective thread I had been missing. Not a single act. A sequence. Every choice aligned toward one outcome. I leaned back, breath shallow, heart steady. I wasn't shocked. I was calm, because clarity brings peace, even when the truth hurts. For the first time, I wasn't questioning myself. I wasn't wondering if I had imagined things. I wasn't doubting my memory. The truth stood on its own now, independent of belief. I thought of the woman I had been when this began. Afraid, confused, searching for reassurance from the very person who had dismantled me. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone measured, grounded, awake. I asked the investigator one final question that night. "Does he know?" "No," he replied. "He believes you're still gone." I closed my eyes and exhaled slowly. Good. Because the truth works best when it arrives unannounced. I didn't rush justice. I didn't act on impulse. I waited. Because lies collapse under their own weight when left unsupported. And soon, very soon, the silence he depended on would no longer protect him. Justice rarely arrives the way we imagine it. It doesn't always come with raised voices or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it comes quietly, armed with facts, patience, and the weight of truth that can no longer be ignored. When the final pieces were ready, I didn't feel excitement. I felt steady. The investigator compiled everything carefully. Not assumptions, not emotions. Just timelines, records, movements, and patterns that told a story far more convincing than words ever could. Together with the attorney, we reviewed everything, slowly, deliberately. Each detail confirmed what my instincts had known long before my mind could accept it. This wasn't an accident of circumstance. It was a design. What shocked me most wasn't the depth of the deception, but how calmly it had been executed. How easily trust had been weaponized. How efficiently my silence had been used against me. But truth has a way of surfacing when it's given time. Legal steps followed, quiet ones, formal ones. The kind that don't seek attention but demand accountability. The evidence spoke clearly. Too clearly to dismiss. Too consistently to deny. And this time, the narrative wasn't written without me. I wasn't present when the final consequences reached him. I didn't need to be. I had learned that closure doesn't require proximity to pain. It requires understanding. What mattered wasn't watching his world change. What mattered was reclaiming mine. For the first time since my father's death, I allowed myself to grieve fully, not just for him, but for the life I lost, for the woman I was before love became something I feared, for the trust I gave freely. But grief no longer controlled me. It passed through me. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It came in quiet moments, in mornings where I woke without dread, in nights where sleep returned gently, in laughter that didn't feel forced. I rebuilt my life intentionally. I chose peace over explanations, growth over resentment, truth over silence. And slowly, the weight I had carried for years began to lift. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't see before. Love should never make you doubt your sanity. Commitment should never require you to shrink. And silence should never cost you your truth. If you're listening to this and something in your heart feels familiar, please hear this. Pay attention to patterns, not promises. Trust consistency more than charm. And never ignore the voice inside you that whispers when something isn't right. Strength doesn't always look like fighting back. Sometimes it looks like waiting, learning, preparing, and choosing yourself, even when it's hard. I once believed my story ended behind locked doors. I was wrong. It was only beginning. Because truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way back to the light. And when it does, it doesn't just reveal what was hidden. It restores what was lost. If this story moved you, even quietly, please let me know in the comments. Your voice matters here. Tell me, what part of this story stayed with you the most? And if you believe, like I do, that stories can heal, teach, and remind us of our worth, please like, share, and subscribe to Silent Echoes of the Heart. Because every story told here carries a lesson. And every lesson might be the one someone needs to hear today. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying. And thank you for believing in the power of truth.